Hi, my name's Scott Shuttner, and I'm standing on this deck which I've spent the last 2 weeks building. Now, this deck will be one of the most used areas of this house because of several simple but important features which I included in the design. Now, I like to think of a deck as sort of a transition area, and because of that, access is critical. That door links the deck to the kitchen dining room area, really the heart of the house. Here, we've added this stairway to give us good access to the front lawn. Now, this is the largest area of the deck and should provide plenty of room for gatherings. As you can see, this whole deck is enclosed with a cedar railing. This is important obviously for safety reasons, but we've chosen the style of this railing so that it complements the style of the house. Now, this deck, as you can see here, is divided into 3 levels, this being the lowest. And we've done this for several reasons. Obviously, it adds some interest and mystery, but what we've done is followed the contour of the land. Also, by dropping the deck, we've dropped the railings. That improves the view from inside the house. Over here, we've added another stairway so that we have good access to the garden area. Now, this area of the deck might be thought of as a wide walkway, which provides a connection between that area of the deck and this front door area up here. It's a functional connection, but it's also an architectural connection. Here at the front door, we have a regular step, and we've also added this wheelchair ramp. Now, while you watch this preview of things to come in the rest of this tape, I'm going to go light the barbecue. I'm going to alternate between the building of 2 decks in this tape, the one you saw in the intro, and this smaller deck, which will allow us to easily show you the basics. I'll take you step by step from the foundation and posts. Oh, let me get mine in first here. Through framing and decking, building a set of stairs, adding a railing, putting in some seating, and finally adding a finish. Okay, Paul, hook up this string for me, will you please? The first thing we do is stretch strings between batter boards to locate the piers our posts will rest on. And then give me a hand down here. Just butt that right into the wall. Okay, we're looking for 16 feet to the outside right there. Make a mark. And we're done. Now, Paul and I have just finished laying out the location for the posts on our deck. Your deck may not be as complicated or have as many angles, so I'd like to show you on this mock-up I've built how to use the same basic principles for a simple square deck. We have a doorway, the usual stud wall, and a typical block foundation. Our deck will come in right under this threshold. Now, a deck is supported by beams and posts which sit on a foundation, and I'd like to show you some of your foundation options. These are precast concrete pier blocks. They're great in a warm climate where you have stable soil conditions. All you do is dig out a hole, put in some gravel, and put these in place. Now, if you have freezing winter conditions, you need to go below the local frost level. We're going to dig a hole and use this cardboard form. These forms are great, they're easy to level up, simple to calculate the amount of concrete you'll need, and they get you a little bit above grade. We'll just pour in our concrete and put in this anchor. Now, our model deck is 7 feet long by 6 feet wide. I've already marked this end of the deck, and I just have to mark the other end here on the siding. Now, just like on our real deck, I have to lay out the location for the posts, and I'll do that with string and batter boards. I've got this set finished. Batter boards are nothing more than 1x4s attached to stakes. I've put these at about 90 degrees and about a foot outside the actual dimensions of our deck, and the strings will cross like this. Since this set's done, let me show you over here how I laid them out. Our deck will be at about 6 feet and our beam will be at about 5. So I want my batter boards right about here. We need to leave the batter boards up as we're building, so we can occasionally replace the strings and check layout. Putting them at least a foot away from the deck's outline protects them from being bumped during the digging. What you make your batter boards out of isn't important, but try and position them at about the same level so the strings come close to touching when they intersect. Well, my first string's in place and it represents the edge of my deck. Let me show you how I did it on the other side. The first thing I do is lower the mark representing the edge of the deck framing closer to the level of the batter boards. Then drive a nail to hold one end of my string. I roll the other end out to Paul, and then the two of us adjust the line perpendicular to the building using a large homemade square. Okay, mark. Then Paul secures the other end to the batter board. Okay, let's check the width, make sure that they're same. Cut me one. 7'1", right on the money. Okay, great. Paul, grab the string, will you? And have it cross at 5 feet exactly. Okay. I'm putting the third string in at 5 feet, even though the deck is 6 feet long. That's because the deck will cantilever over the post and beam by 1 foot. Now this, remember, is the edge of our deck. I'm going to come in 8 inches to the center of my post. To do that, I'll drop a plumb bob, have it cross the line, use this marker to mark the center. Now we'll do the other end. Now this tool's fine if you only got a couple holes to dig, but since I got 25, I highly recommend this rig. Well, I don't know about you, but my back isn't getting any younger, and besides, this can even be cheaper than paying someone to dig by hand. This rig goes for about $100 an hour, and the job took an hour and a half. The drill rig leaves some loose soil in the bottom of the hole, which you'll need to tamp down. Paul's using a 4x4 with a rebar handle here. Next, I measure the depth of each hole. Then mark and cut the lengths of tubing, adding 2 or 3 inches to each one so that they stick up a little bit above ground level. After cutting, I check the tube's length by putting it in its appropriate hole, then measure and cut the others. Now this side slope is too steep for the Jeep, so find someone young and turn them loose. Once all the tubes are cut and checked for length, we need to pull them out and wrap them with plastic. In cold climates, poured piers need to be protected from the lifting action of freezing soil. In our area, wrapping the form in the 6mm polyethylene keeps the soil from bonding to the tube. Now, if you're digging holes in wet soil or clay, it's a good idea to put a layer of gravel in the bottom to help drainage. You can also add rock to a hole which was dug a little too deep. Just make sure to compact the rock firmly. Finally, we can start backfilling our tubes. We center the tubes under their strings, check for plumb, and tamp the dirt in stages using a board. At this stage, the strings are all we have to go by. Take your time and position the tubes accurately. Well, it's usually pretty hectic once the concrete truck shows up.
Okay, we ready? Here it comes.
And it's really helpful to have a few extra friends around. Because of the site, we have to wheelbarrow the mud to these holes and fill them one by one. If you just have a few holes to fill, you can probably mix the concrete yourself. But if you're paying for labor and your deck is fairly large, it's probably cheaper to have it delivered. I talk more about this in the book.
I think we'll fill the rest of them from up above.
Now before the tubes are completely filled, Paul drops in lengths of 5/8 reinforcing steel. Then we fill the tubes, punch the gravel below the surface, and smooth off the tops. Here I'm using an ordinary kitchen spatula. Well, after the concrete is firmed up a little bit, I go around and set the post anchors in the center of each pier. Here, I'm setting them flush with the top of the concrete. In a wetter climate, it's a good idea to hold them off the concrete a little bit.
Well, the next thing we'll do is mount our ledger board. This is a piece of treated 2x8, and on it we'll mount our joist hangers. Now, we'll mount it right to the wall, but as you can see, it wouldn't make sense to mount it on top of the siding. We'll have to lay out and cut a hole in our siding. This will also allow us to get some bolts into the rim joist. Now on our model deck, I'm going to hold the decking right up under the threshold. But if you have a lot of driven rain or no overhangs on your house, you may want to hold it down a little so the water can't seep in.
I first have to mark out the amount of siding that needs to be removed so I can attach the ledger flat to the rim joist. I just measure down the thickness of the decking plus the width of the ledger, transfer that measurement to each end with a level, and snap a cut line. This temporary piece of 1x nailed at the end will give my saw a flat surface to ride on when I make the cut. Just make sure the saw is set to the right depth and that there are no nails in the way. For the long horizontal cut on the bottom, I need to readjust the saw. I have to be careful as I start this plunge cut. You can see I'm holding the guard back and slowly lowering the saw into the wood. At the ends, I need to finish off the cuts with my chisel.
Well, we've got one more thing to do before we install the ledger board. That's to put on the flashing. This flashing is nothing more than an L-shaped piece of galvanized sheet metal, but it's what keeps the water out of the house. Got a little setup here to show you how that works. We'll slide the flashing up under the siding, put on our ledger board, slide the flashing down and bend this little drip angle, put our decking board in place. That's it. So let's do it.
All I did was measure the flashing for length and notch out for under the threshold. Now you notice I'm holding the ledger back 1.5 inches from the cut edge of the siding.
That'll leave room for the end of the first joist. Well, since the whole deck hangs off the ledger, you'll want to make sure it's fastened securely to the house. I first tack it in place with a few 16s, then follow up with a couple half-inch lag bolts, at least every 3 or 4 feet. Lags need a small pilot hole for the threads and a larger hole for the shank. If you're attaching ledgers to concrete, you'll have to use masonry anchors.
Okay, cut me 1.5 inches there.
Now I'm marking the location of the joists. For this deck, every 24 inches. The joists will be attached to the ledger with joist hangers. And I use a scrap of joist material, which makes it easier to space and align each hanger to the layout, and assures that the top of each joist will be flush with the top of the ledger. Now make sure to nail through all the holes using galvanized joist hanger nails. On the big deck, we use a builder's level to position the ledgers.
Okay, up 2, up 1, up, right there, mark it. All right, let's get the ledger.
Now the siding on this house is very flat, and there's no reason for us to cut it out to attach the ledgers. But water would be trapped if we attached the ledgers tight to the siding. So here, we're first nailing up treated plywood shims to create a gap. We need a shim at each lag bolt location. If you live in a place that gets a lot of rain, gaskets made of 90-pound tar paper placed on either side of the plywood shims will help seal the bolt holes.
Give me a push up on this, man. Well, now that we got the last of our joist hangers in place, we're ready to cut our post. I'm going to do that by using this joist, which is already cut to length, and my 4-foot level. I'll bring it down a little. There, that's level. I'm going to make a mark for the bottom of the joist. Now we'll take this off. Okay, this marks the bottom of our joist. I'm going to mark the bottom of the beam at 9 1/4. And I'm going to go a little lower so we're sure our deck slopes away from the house. That's where we'll cut our post.
Now I'm using a skill saw to make these cuts, and because I am, I have to make a couple of passes, rolling the post as I go.
Now another way we can mark our post is with a water level. These are great. You can buy them at any hardware store. Their distance of use is limited only by the length of tubing you have, and you could level around a corner. Now after we take off the caps, Paul will hold it till his bubble is at the bottom of the ledger. We'll make a mark here at level. That's the bottom of our joist. Measure down the same as the other side, 9 1/4 plus a little bit extra. That's where we'll cut this post. Okay, down 1 inch. Hold it up 1/8, right there. Mark the top of your tape. Okay, let's cut it right there. Now one more thing about these posts. If you can, try and put the factory treated end down.
We do this because of the preservative in the end of the post. If it sits in any water on top of the pier, it'll be better protected. Now at this stage, we only put in a couple of nails until we're sure everything is right on.
Okay, go ahead and nail that to the post.
And as we set each post, we need braces. These are temporary until the beam and joists tie everything together.
Okay, level it up.
We also want to make sure to plumb the posts in both directions as best we can.
All right. Okay.
Well, now it's time for our beam, which rests on these posts. You could use a solid 4x beam, but ours will be made of these two 2x10s and these treated 1/2-inch plywood spacers. This gap will keep any water from getting trapped, and the angle on these spacers will also aid the drainage. Now let's nail it together.
Well, nothing special here. Both pieces are cut the same length. Just flush them up and drive in 3 or 4 galvanized 16s from each side at the shim locations.
Well, you remember our beam cantilevers over our post, and I've marked that here. One other thing about our beam. Lumber usually isn't straight and will have a crown. When you install your beam, make sure the crown is up. That way the weight of the deck will help straighten it out. Now before I plumb these posts and permanently attach them to the beam with these brackets, I want to install the joists and make sure everything lines up just right.
Well, before we put in the joists on the small deck, we're going to raise the beams for the bigger deck.
Okay, Paul, let me get mine in first here.
These beams are made in just the same way.
Okay, you pretty good? I'm gonna get a toenail in there.
Now, instead of these sandwiched beams, you could use treated 4x timbers if they're available in your area.
All right, Paul, why don't you put your corner together there with some 16s?
These beams, which follow the outline of the house, are mitered and joined over a post.
All right, that'll do for now.
And we just keep working our way around.
Thanks, guys.
Now, back to the small deck.
Well, I've temporarily nailed my beam to my post, and now we're ready for some joists. I want to be sure to crown them all. This first one's the end joist, and it fits in this 1.5-inch pocket we left, like this. Now I'll put in some 16s and a clip on the back, flush it up with the end of my beam, and put in some toenails. Now this joist cantilevers over the beam, and I like this system for a couple reasons. It's forgiving of any inaccuracies in setting the post, cuts down the span of the beam, and I like the way it looks. Now your design might call for something different. You can butt your joists into the beam and use these joist hangers, then your joist to be flush with the top of the beam. Of course then the top of the beam would be level with the ledger, and the beam would be at the edge of your deck. Now we'll lay out for the rest of the joists. I'll hook it on the edge of the beam.
Matching the ledger, I lay out for the joists, 24 inches on center. Then, to secure the end joist, I make a homemade clip by cutting off one side of an extra joist hanger. These joists are heavy. When cutting, I support the board with my foot so the saw won't bind. Make sure to crown each joist and slide them in place. Now over the beam, toenail from each side, or the coat in your area may call for metal ties here. And nail off the hangers. Finally, the rim joist goes on. You can take the quick and easy way and use a simple butt joint, like we're doing here, or miter the pieces to hide the end grain.
Okay, up a little. Okay, right there.
We just drive 3 16s into the end of each joist.
Now one more thing. We want to make sure our deck is square. We've taken care to make it that way with our layout but I like to double check with diagonals just to be sure. 108 1/4. Now if this one's the same, we know we're square. 108 1/8. We're within 1/8, so that's close enough for a deck. If we were off a lot, we might have to adjust the relationship of the beam to the post before we put on our bracket.
After framing the smaller deck, we start joisting the bigger deck.
Okay, bring it in.
Paul and I use the big square to position one joist perpendicular to the ledger. Then, hook our tape and mark layout. On this deck, the joists span a longer distance and need to be on 16-inch centers. Same thing here. Toenails from each side into the beam.
Okay.
Well, here I have a helper who raises and lowers the rim flush with each joist as I work my way down. Even on a complicated deck like this, with level changes and angles, it's just a matter of filling in with joists every 16 inches. Here the end of our joists butt into a beam instead of a ledger, and meet the beam at an angle.
Okay, snap it right through that mark.
We've let our joists run long, and now Paul and I can snap one line and cut them all at once. That way we'll end up with a perfectly straight rim.
Let's get these other two while we're at it.
I square up a cut line from the chalk line and make the cuts. Now I don't like eating treated sawdust, so I make sure to wear my mask. Cutting from up above is a lot easier, and you can see that I had to angle my saw blade to make these cuts.
Okay, down. Okay, can you see it okay?
Yeah.
All right.
That's good.
Let's get the other side now. Now, one of the ways you can add interest in building is with angles, just like on our rail deck. I've chopped out this square corner that we built earlier so I can show you how to add this 45-degree angle. You can see it's not necessary for these joists to meet. They just need to extend a few inches past where the new miter will be. Now, this angle on our model deck is pretty small, and chances are yours will be quite a bit larger, but the cutting and the laying out will still be the same. So let's do it. Now, one of the first things we do in laying out this 45 is to find the imaginary corner formed by the outside of these joists. Now, since our model deck is so small, this framing square works pretty well, but for a large angle you may need to use strings or boards to find that point. Now we measure back the same distance from that corner, 10 inches in this case, draw our cut line, set our saw at 22.5, which is half of a 45 degree, and cut the miter. see, long point to long point is 14 1/8. Since all these nails will be seen, I drive them carefully and set them with a punch. Well, that's all there is to it. Now, another great way to add interest to a deck is with a level change. Here, the upper deck is supported by this beam, which is resting on the lower deck, and that's supported by this beam. There's more than one way to support a level change, and there's more about that in the book. Now, all I have to do is add a transition step. Let me show you how to do that. The first thing Paul and I need to do is add a double joist, which will support both the front of the step we're building and the ends of the deck boards on the lower level. This double joist is supported by a wide hanger at the ledger and rests on a beam like all the other joists. After the beam's nailed off, we can build the box which will be our step. It's nothing more than a very narrow deck with a small chunk of rim, ledger with shims, a front joist resting on the double joist below, a joist in back, and a few chunks of blocking to support the decking. Well, as you can see, all I've done is built a simple box to act as a step between this level and this level. I've just finished installing some bracing on this deck. Now, our model deck only had posts this tall and didn't really require any extra lateral bracing. But with posts this tall and a deck this big, our local codes required it. Just be sure to check your local codes too. This is only one kind of bracing you might use. I've got more examples in the book. But this is easy. I use pieces of treated 2x6 cut at a 45 on the ends. I tack them in place, and I leave a small gap here so the water can run off. And then secure the bracing with 1/4-inch lags through pilot holes. Well, here I have some 2x samples of wood which are commonly used for decking. This first one is a piece of western red cedar, and this is the kind we'll be using on our deck. Now, this stuff is naturally resistant to decay, it's stable in the weather, has a nice color, and doesn't raise splinters as it ages. Another softwood which is similar to this cedar is this redwood, except this is a little harder and a little stronger, and it is very resistant to decay. One other obvious difference is its color. Now, both these woods will age to a natural silver gray if left unfinished. Also, in both these woods, the heartwood is the part that's resistant to decay,
so be sure to choose a grade with less of the light color sapwood if you are using them. Now this third sample is a piece of treated lumber, which may be Doug fir or southern pine, depending upon what area of the country you're building in. This is treated with CCA, that's copper chromium arsenate, and it is toxic, so if you're using it, be sure to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. On the ends here, you can see the characteristic green color where the chemical is soaked into the wood. So in this piece, the manufacturer has followed that treatment with a brown stain to color that green color. I'll be using this type of wood for my joists, but personally I feel much better using either the redwood or the cedar wherever I'll be coming into contact with the wood. Now this last piece is another piece of redwood, but it's just a little thinner. It's called 5/4 and it's 1 inch thick. You can save some money by using this stuff, but the joists will need to be spaced closer together. Well, now we're ready to lay some decking. And the first one is the one that goes up against the house. I've chosen a nice straight one for that because it'll act as a guide in nailing the rest of our boards. Now all our decking boards will overhang this edge by 1 inch. I've already cut this board to that exact length. That's because later on it'll be hard to saw right up next to the siding. I've also cut this notch in the corner so that our decking will fit under the siding. The rest of our decking boards we'll let run long, then I'll snap a line and cut them off all at one time. Now all it's left to do is to caulk the flashing and bend this drip edge. The reason this flashing's here in the first place is to keep water out of the house. This drip edge I'm creating will direct any water away from the face of the ledger. Then it's really important to run a bead of good caulk wherever the flashing butts into the siding, and especially here under the threshold. And finally, caulk around all edges of the ledger and in-joists where they penetrate the siding. Finally, we can fit our first piece of decking. Okay. Now you can see here that it fits tightly under the siding. All right, you in there pretty good?
Yep.
A tight fit looks good, but I'll often leave a ½ inch gap here so that puddles of water don't soak the siding. Well, we're ready for our second board. Now I want to leave a crack between all these decking boards for the water to drain through. Now this cedar board is pretty wet, so I want my crack to be small. Later on, when the board dries out, the crack will get larger. Now I've got a homemade spacer here, made of an 8-penny nail through a little block of wood. The block keeps the nail from falling through. You can also buy a commercially made product with a thinner or a thicker spacer. This also doesn't fall through. Paul and I just continue on, nailing each board in place. You can see how I'm angling these nails. This helps to hold the boards tight to the joists. You can see the gap is a little fat here, so if I can't close it up by shoving on it, I lever it over with a chisel. If the gap's too tight, carefully start your chisel and wedge it open. Well, I'd like to show you some of the other ways to fasten these decking boards down. So far, I've been using these 16-penny hot galvanized nails. These work great for the cedar, which doesn't have a tendency to cup, and they leave a small hole where they go in. For the rest of the deck, I'm going to use these clip nails, which fit in my pneumatic gun. These are galvanized with a rosin coating on them to keep them from pulling out. The advantage of these is that they're fast, but they do leave a larger hole where they go in. You can get these in stainless if you live near the sea.
Now another system is with screws. These are a galvanized screw with a ceramic coating. Using these will make it easy to pull up any deck boards in the future, but they are slow to install. Now another system, which doesn't leave any exposed fasteners, is this deck clip. It installs like this. You nail it to the joist, nail it to the deck board before, then pound on your next decking board like this. They look like that. Now these are kind of expensive and they're slow to install too. The use of pneumatic nail drivers has become a necessity for most contractors, and I find them very helpful, even though they do leave a large hole. If you use a nailer, just make sure to use nails recommended for decks. Now here I want to show you how I butt two deck boards together over a single joist. To keep the nails from splitting the ends of the boards, first drill angled pilot holes. Now we don't always drill pilot holes in this cedar, but it's a must for almost every other wood. And I leave a gap so the board ends can dry out if they get wet. Only one problem here. These joints will eventually fill with dirt. Now here's another way to deal with butt joints, especially in a wet climate. It's best to design your deck so that these butts fall on a double joist system like this, with a spacer in between. That way, any water that gets caught in this butt joint will be able to drain on through into this crack. Now as we get down to the last 3 or 4 pieces of our deck, we're going to have to start paying attention to how we're going to end this edge. Remember, we had 1 inch overhang, so all we have to do is measure that distance out and rip this last board. But let's say our decking was ending something like this. We wouldn't want to put on a narrow little strip which might split and fall off in time. So we could use 1 wide board, that'd be the best, or we could divide this distance in half and use, say, 2 2x4s. That way this last piece will be wide enough to last. And here's the last board. It's only a little wider than it should be, so we'll nail it down and later rip it to the right width, leaving us a 1 inch overhang. Here on the side of the deck, we also want a 1 inch overhang. I make a couple of marks, snap a line, and cut them to length. Now this is a finish cut, so I'm using a sharp blade in my saw. After making our rip out front here, the last cut to make is along the angle. Again, an inch overhang. Well, it only took us a couple hours to lay the boards on the little deck. The bigger deck is a different story, and that's where we're working now. Yeah, throw that nailer back. Up here, the house has a lot of angles, and many boards require special cuts. Good. Here, we're nailing boards around the entry. We've had to rip this board, which goes against the house, and cut away the corner trim. How's your corner? Good. Good here. You can see here I've had to use 2 boards to finish off the run on this section. Well, here we are at the step, and to highlight the change in levels, the decking boards run in the other direction. You notice, too, that I sized the step so it's exactly 3 boards wide. Behind me, you can see another framed-in box for a step up to the kitchen door. And off to the left, the guys are decking the lowest level, which requires 2 steps down.
Well, since our deck is 3 feet off the ground, we're going to need a set of stairs. I've already cut 2 out of the 3 carriages and installed them by nailing through the back of the deck and adding these clips. Well, since this is a model deck, I've used untreated 2x12s for my carriages, but you would want to use treated lumber so it won't rot. And the bottom of these carriages rest on this leveled and treated piece of lumber, but this could be a poured footing or a poured landing. Now, before I cut this 3rd carriage, let me show you how I figured out the run and rise for this stairs. The run here is 10 inches, and that was chosen so I could use these 2 pieces of 2x6 cedar and still have an overhang. The rise was determined like this. The first thing I need to know was the height from the top of our deck down to our leveled board. To do that, I just took my level and measured down, and it's 35 inches. Then all I had to do was divide that by an even number of risers, and in this case, 7 inches works perfectly. I've got one more carriage to mark and cut. I use a framing square with stair buttons set to the rise and run. And I just work my way down this 2x12, marking the notches. At the bottom, I have to remove 1.5 inches to allow for the tread thickness. And at the top, I have to add 1 inch to compensate for the overhang of the deck. I've got more details about stair building in the book. Now, when cutting the notches, I'm careful to saw on the waist side of the line. And finish the cuts with a handsaw. Down here, I tack the board in place, and I'll follow up later with a clip. At the top, I nail through the rim into the carriage and add a clip. Now the treads. I've cut these to length, allowing 1 inch overhang on both ends. Now the next thing our deck needs is a railing, and I've just built this section for our model deck. I've installed these 4x4 posts on the corners, I've notched them around this decking, and bolted them firmly to this rim joist with these carriage bolts.
In between these posts, I've installed this balustrade of 2x2 cedar, which is attached with screws through this bottom and top 2x4. I've also notched this 4x4 post to provide some extra support for this bottom 2x4. Now on the corner, I've used a pair of posts instead of a single one, which would have a more complicated notch at the bottom. This last section of railing completes it over to the stairs. I've also installed these 2 posts for my stair railing. They're notched the same at the bottom and bolted with carriage bolts, but they're a little different at the top, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, let's go up top. For this railing, I've installed a 2x6 piece of cedar as the top cap. I've mitered it at the corner, and I've angled the ends to finish it off. Now this railing is 36 inches tall, but some codes may require it to be as much as 42 inches tall. Also, none of these spaces is larger than 6 inches, and some codes may require that to be as narrow as 4 inches. Be sure to check your local code first. Now on the other side of the deck, I'll show you how to build this railing, and to finish it off, I'll install the stair rail. Now each post gets let into the overhang of the deck. So I'm marking out for the notch-out cut, which will allow the post to fit tight to the joist below. Well, I've just finished cutting the first post. To do that, I measured up 8 inches, then I came in 1.5 inches. After I cut the notch, I beveled the end. It fits into our deck notch like this. Now, we'll do the second one. I lay out the post end by measuring up 8 inches and squaring the line across 3 sides. Set my square to the depth of the notch, in this case 1.5 inches. Set my saw to 1.5 inches to make the first cut. Then reset the blade to full depth for the rip cuts. A chisel finishes it off. Next, I want to dress up the end of the post with a 45-degree bevel. Finally, I need to cut the dado which holds the bottom rail. Just a few passes with the skill saw set to 1/2 inch, and a little cleanup with the chisel. The posts are attached to the framing with 2 3/8-inch carriage bolts. Drill the upper pilot hole first, the same diameter as the bolt. Drive the bolt home. Plumb the post. Then you can put in the second bolt. After tightening the bolts, check again for plumb in both directions and shave or shim if necessary. Now with all the posts up and straight, I can start making the railing sections. These sections are simply ladders with 2x4s for top and bottom rails and 2x2s in between. For this length of railing section, it works out for me to start with a 2x2 baluster right in the middle.
I put it in position, then use a 2x spacer to mark the other locations. This is a lot faster than laying them out with a tape measure. Then in the very middle of the 2x4 rails, I drill pilot holes for screws which secure the balusters. Drilling through the top rail marks for the pilot holes in the bottom rail. Now to find the exact centers of the balusters, I just mark diagonals. These are 3-inch corrosion-resistant screws. To keep these 2x2s from twisting, you can lock them in place with a finish nail. The bottom rail is held in the dado with a couple galvanized finish nails. And a toenail up here on top. A 2x6 cap goes across the top, overhanging the same on both sides, and is secured with screws from underneath. Here at the end, I cut a couple of 45s and dress it up with a plane.
Well, we're finally ready for the railing on our stairs. I built this one out of a 1-inch cedar board attached to the edge of this 2x4. This design will let me get a good grip on this railing. Now, as I said earlier, the bottom of this stair post is notched the same as the regular post. But these stair posts have to be shorter because our stair railing is only 30 inches high and our regular railing on the deck is 36 inches high. I've also angled the tops of these posts so the water will drain off. Now I'll attach this rail like this, 2 screws here, 2 screws here, and I'll put these balusters on from the back side, which will span the gap between the lower rail, which I've already installed, and the upper rail, like that. Now, let's do it.
In order to leave finger space around the hand grip, I temporarily tack spacers onto the top of the posts. Then I position the handrail flush with the top of the deck rail and screw it in place. Next, I add the balusters, and you can see I've beveled them to shed water. And again, I space them using a 2x block. Well, now that we've finished the rails on the small deck, we can earn our money on the big deck. There are a lot more posts up here, but they go on the same way. Now, a few features make a deck stand out as much as the railing, and the railing you'll see us building up here is different than on the small deck. We start by bridging the tops of the posts with rounded over cedar rails on edge, which are held at the right height by 2x's tacked to the posts.
Where two rails intersect, we lock the miter tight with two finish nails in from each side. Then we nail the rails to the posts. A second 1-inch thick rail goes below the top rail and is also temporarily supported by a shorter 2x4. And in the long run, where we have to join two pieces, it's good to use a miter, so when the wood shrinks, the joint won't open up. And finally, there's a 1-inch bottom rail. The balusters bridge the two lower rails and are spaced the same way as on the small deck. One screw at the top and one at the bottom. After the balusters are in, I like to add a few finishing touches with the router. I round over the ends of the rails, and put a 45-degree chamfer across the exposed edges, like here on the steps. This not only looks good, but keeps the edges from splintering.
Now, one of the last things I want to add to this deck is some seating. Here I've built a frame for a bench which will stretch along here. This frame will be attached to these 4x4 posts. Now, this frame is simple and easy to build. It only has 3 parts. It has an angled back where I'll put some 2x6s for a backrest, and a slightly tipped seat where I'll put some more 2x6s. Now, one of the big advantages of this frame is that it can be added at any time, even after the deck is built, because it's not an integral part of this railing system. Now all I need to do is add one frame for that end of the bench, and let me show you how to do that.
Now making these seating frames is a snap once you've built a jig like this which holds the parts in position. This jig is easy to make, and plans for it are in the book. Once it's done, you can make them by the dozen. The frames are just 3 pieces of 2x held together with a couple carriage bolts. This tape on the drill bit works as a depth gauge when drilling bolt holes. We only need a pair of frames for our small deck, but for a long run of seating, you'd need one every 4 or 5 feet. I fasten them to the post at the top with a couple of screws. And toenail the bottoms to the deck. Time to put the seat boards on. I space them with a nail, and you can see that I've sized the frames so the 3 boards are just right. Now all of these ends will be seen, and especially on the back boards, it's easier to dress the edges before they're nailed up. I'm only using 2 boards here. The gap below makes for a more comfortable seat.
Well, that's all there is to it. Now, one of the last things I want to show you how to build is this planter. After you build a deck this large, you're bound to have some scraps left over, and this planter is a good place to use them up. Each side is made with 3 1x8s,
which are screwed from the inside to this 1-inch cross piece here. Two of the sides are different in that they have a ledger board attached to hold up the bottom, and the cross piece at the top is a little longer here to allow for the joinery. Now, let's finish putting it together. Well, this plan is really easy to make. Once the sides are built, just nail it together at the top and along the sides. Add the bottom boards, leaving some space for air and drainage. Then nail on a frame around the top. Finish it off by locking all the corners and setting the nails. I've included plans for this planter in the book. Well, now it's time to apply a finish to our deck. And I could let the cedar age to a natural silver gray, but generally my customers like to maintain the original color of the wood. Now, finishes come in two types, either a penetrating oil type or a surface building type, like paint or varnish. I don't like to use the second type because they're really difficult to refinish. Now, this semi-transparent oil stain is an example of an oil penetrating finish. This has a fair amount of pigment in it, and it comes in a lot of colors, so it's a good choice if you're trying to change the color of your deck. This is called beige gray. Now, this is another oil penetrating type of finish called redwood. It has less pigment in it, and it changes the color of the wood to a slight red. Now, we're going to be using this one, which is a clear. I've chosen this because it really enhances the natural color of the wood. This contains a mildewcide and a water repellent, and also some UV stabilizers to protect against the sun's rays. Now, if your deck is starting to turn gray from age, like the top half of this board, there's several products you can use which contain oxalic acid to restore it to almost its original color. We treated this one just a few minutes ago. For a deck this size, a brush and a roller are just fine. And for this type of finish, we need to get on 2 coats, with the second being applied before the first is dried. Just brush plenty of finish into all the nooks and crannies, and be sure to fully soak all the ingrain. To save my back and save time, I like to use a roller on most of the horizontal surfaces. Well, now on to the real deck. My job up here on the big deck is rolling the finish on all these deck boards, and I'm wearing a respirator for a couple of important reasons. First of all, we'll spend all day finishing a deck this size, and secondly, Paul is using a sprayer and we want to protect ourselves against the mist. These sprayers, which you pump up by hand, use air pressure to move the liquid and are really the way to go when finishing railings. Here I'm working my way down one of 2 staircases which connect the deck to the lawn. And finally, the last of the second coat gets spread on the wheelchair ramp we added to the end of the deck. Well, about all that's left to do is to set a few of the nails I've missed, then do a thorough cleanup. One of my last thoughts to you is to tell you to plan and work carefully, but don't fret, because it's in the nature of a deck to turn out beautifully.
If you've enjoyed this tape, take a peek at some of our other fine home building videos. In Scott Schuttner's other book video set, he shows you how to build two types of stairs, a straight run with plywood treads and risers, and a more formal L-shaped stair made of oak. Give your home a durable hardwood floor. Don Bollinger shows you how to install oak strip flooring, how to load and operate sanding machines from your local rental shop, and how to choose and apply a rich finish to provide long-lasting beauty and protection. In his video workshop with accompanying booklet, Master Carpenter Tom Law shows you how to install, level, and secure a variety of doors and windows. In his tape Installing Trim, Craig Savage demonstrates the finer points of trim carpentry, including difficult-to-work-with crown molding. You'll learn how to handle real-world situations, walls that aren't straight, floors that aren't level, and openings that are out of square. Paul Levine has developed a foolproof system for making kitchen cabinets. Using standard tools in a home workshop, Levine's easy-to-follow system lets you construct elegantly simple cabinets that add up to a kitchen of lasting beauty. Whether you build or buy your kitchen cabinets, you'll benefit from Tom Law's expertise in this video workshop. No one is better qualified to demonstrate how to install cabinets and the countertops that bridge them. This video has got all the tricks of the trade that will allow you to achieve professional results. Larry Hahn's three-part series, Framing Floors and Stairs, Framing Walls, and Framing Roofs, is an education in framing carpentry that will help improve even a master framer's efficiency. Each tape stands alone as an in-depth guide to its part of the framing job. As a set, they will help you frame a house efficiently, from mudsill to ridge. All of these videos and their companion books are available individually, but you save when you buy them as sets. To order any of these tapes, just phone toll-free 1-800-888-8286.